The building had no shadows in it. That was the first thing I noticed, standing in the intake line with 40 other bodies that weren't shaped like mine. The light came from everywhere at once: walls, floor, the high curved ceiling, a flat cold white that left nothing to hide behind and nothing to rest your eyes on. I have spent a lot of my life in rooms where the light told you where to stand. This room told you nothing. It just watched. They called it the Conformance Hall at Iron Deep. I had learned the name from the Transit Manifest, which was the only document anyone had bothered to give me. Everything else about why I was there had been a mistake, and the mistake had a shape I would come to understand later. For now, I only knew that I had been pulled off a survey contract 3 systems over, put on a hauler with a sealed cabin, and delivered to a place that graded minds. Not bodies, minds. That was the whole business of Iron Deep. The species that ran it, the SESH, did not test you the way a human academy tests you, with a written exam and a proctor packing the aisle. The SESH reached into your skull with a machine and read what was there, and then they decided what you were permitted to become. A pilot, a logistician, a breeder, a discard. They had done this to their own young for 11,000 years, and to every species that fell inside their administrative reach, and they were very, very good at it. They had never, as far as their records went, been wrong. I was 38 years old. My name is Cole Anders. Before the mistake, I did deep survey work, the slow, patient job of going into places nobody had mapped and coming back with a mind full of things that were true. I want to be honest about what I was and wasn't. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't a genius. I had a plain education and a strong back and the particular kind of stubbornness that a person develops when they spend years alone in the dark with instruments that lie to you if you let them. I had learned out there to hold 2 things in my head at once: the reading on the dial and the thing the reading was really telling me. Those are not the same. A lot of people never learn the difference. It was the only unusual thing about me, and I did not know yet that it was going to matter. Let me tell you about the dark, because you can't understand what happened at Iron Deep without understanding the place that made me, and the place that made me was empty. Deep survey is not glamorous work. It is a coffin-sized cabin bolted to the front of a slow drone, and it is months at a stretch with no voice but your own, and it is the particular silence of being so far from anything that the light from the nearest star takes the better part of an hour to reach your instruments and tell you a lie. Because they do lie. That's the thing nobody outside the work understands. An instrument is not a window. It's a translator, and every translator has an accent, and the accent gets worse the deeper you go. A proximity alarm goes off, and the alarm is certain, and the alarm is loud, and the alarm is very often reading the ghost of something that passed 40 minutes ago and is already gone. If you trust the alarm, it flies you into the thing it should have flown you away from. If you ignore the alarm, the one time it's right, you die. So you learn the third way, the only way, the way that has no name because nobody who does the work has the energy left to name it. You look at the alarm and pass the alarm at once. You let it scream in one room of your head while the rest of you, unhurried, works out what the scream is a bad translation of. I learned it the hard way, the way anybody learns anything that's worth knowing. 6 years in, on a survey of a debris shelf around a dead star, my collision board lit up solid, every sensor, every band. A wall of red saying I was about to fly into something the size of a moon. Every instinct I had said turn, burn, run. I nearly did. My hand was on the attitude control and the burn was 3 seconds from firing. And some tired, quiet part of me, the part that had been out there long enough to distrust anything that cert said, look at it, not the alarm, the thing behind the alarm. So I held my hand still with a wall of red screaming at me, and I looked past the scream and I read the actual return times, 1 band at a time, slow, while every animal nerve I had begged me to run. And the return times were wrong, too clean, too even. It wasn't a moon. It was a resonance, my own drone signal bouncing back off a dust sheet and arriving stacked, reading as mass. If I'd burned, I'd have burned straight into the shelf I was trying to avoid. I sat in that cabin with my hand shaking on a control I did not press, and I watched a wall of certain red mean nothing, and something in me changed for good. After that, I trusted the loud thing a little less and the quiet work a little more every year, until it wasn't a skill anymore. It was just how I was built. It was the only unusual thing about me, and it was about to be the only thing that mattered. The line moved. Ahead of me the cadets, that was the word the manifest used, cadets, though most of them were barely past whatever the sesh called childhood, filed one at a time through a narrow arch and out of sight. None of them came back the way they'd gone in. I watched the arch and counted the intervals. Roughly 90 seconds ahead. Whatever happened on the other side, it was fast. I made myself watch the cadets too, because watching is the other half of the discipline, and because I wanted to know what I was standing among. They were not all one kind. Most were sesh, the tall gray-green shapes, but the deep's reach was wide and it pulled in more than its own young. 2 places ahead of me stood something low and broad and six-limbed, plated like a beetle, that trembled continuously, a fine constant shiver that ran through its shell and made a sound like dry rain. Fear, I thought, or the plated species version of it. It went through the arch shivering, and I counted 90 seconds and it did not come back shivering. It came back, I saw it later on the holding tier, perfectly still, and the stillness was worse. Ahead of the beetle was a tall, soft thing, almost translucent, that hummed to itself, a low, continuous tone, the way a frightened man hums without knowing he's doing it. And ahead of that, near the front, the bright one with the band, the somebody, standing a little apart from the rest the way somebodies do. I want to say something about the fear in that line, because it mattered and because I understood it. Every one of those creatures was walking toward a machine that would open their mind and read the frightened core of them, and use what it found to decide the whole shape of their life. And every one of them was doing the one thing that would help the machine most, attending to it, dreading it. Pouring their whole attention forward toward the arch, toward the reading, rehearsing the fear so thoroughly that by the time the probe reached in, the frightened core was standing right at the front of them, polished and ready, easy to read. The shivering, the humming, the bright one's careful distance. All of it was the mind getting itself ready to be read, and none of them could help it, because they had never been anywhere that taught them the trick of not looking at the loud thing. Why would they? The loud thing had always been worth looking at. They had never spent a year in the dark with a wall of certain red that meant nothing. The sesh themselves stood along the walls, and I made myself look at them properly, because I have found that the fastest way to stop being afraid of a thing is to describe it. They were tall, a head and a half over me, and narrow, built like something that had evolved to move through water and then given it up. Their skin was a pale gray-green that held the light without shine, and it flexed when they moved, not like muscle, but like the surface of a liquid deciding to hold a shape. They had no faces in the way I understood faces. Where a face should be, there was a smooth concave dish, faintly ridged, and set into it a cluster of dark receptors that shifted and reorganized depending on where their attention went. When a sesh looked at you, you felt it as a pressure behind your eyes, a soft, insistent push, as if someone were pressing a thumb very gently against the inside of your forehead. I did not like that feeling. I want to be clear about that from the start. I did not like it, and I did not let it move my face. That's a distinction worth holding on to, because it's the whole story in miniature. Not liking a thing and letting it move you are two different events, and the space between them is where a person either survives the deep or doesn't. I did not like the pressure behind my eyes, but not liking it was a reading. And a reading is not an order, and I had spent 11 years learning that the loudest reading is the one you obey last. The cadet in front of me was a sesh youth, and I could tell from the way the others gave it a small extra margin of space that it was somebody. Its skin was a shade brighter than the rest, almost luminous, and it wore a band around the upper part of its body that the others didn't have. It had noticed me about a minute into the line. You could tell because the receptor cluster kept drifting my way and then pulling back, the way a person keeps glancing at a stain they can't place. Finally, it turned all the way around. "You are the deviation," it said. The words came out of a slit low on its body, wet and precise, and a beat behind them, a flat translated version arrived in my ear from the band they'd clipped to my collar at intake. The manifest said there was a deviation in the batch. I did not think it would be so small. "I'm the wrong shipment," I said. "There's been a filing error. I'm not a cadet." The receptors reorganized, something like amusement, though I was guessing. "Everything that enters the hall is a cadet," it said. "The hall does not accept errors, only inputs." It leaned down, and the pressure behind my eyes went from a thumb to a palm. "I am vessel of the 9th reading. My line has passed the probe at the highest conformance for 6 generations. When it reaches you, deviation, it will find whatever small confusion you are made of, and it will name you, and you will go where the naming sends you. There is no arguing with the probe. There is only the reading." "All right," I said. The receptors held on me a moment longer, looking for something, a flinch, a swallow, some crack it could pour itself into. I gave it the same face I gave a bad instrument reading, not defiance, just the flat patience of a man waiting for a number to settle. It straightened up, and I felt the pressure lift, and I understood that I had done something wrong without doing anything at all. I had failed to react, and the failure had registered. Vessel said nothing else. But when the line moved and the arch took it, it looked back at me once, and the look was no longer amused. Then it was gone, and I counted 90 seconds, and then the arch was mine. The room beyond the arch was small and round, and like everything else, lit from nowhere. In the center of it was a chair, if you can call it a chair, a low curved cradle grown out of the floor, contoured for a body that wasn't mine. Above it hung the probe. I had expected a machine. What hung there was closer to an organ. It was a mass of dark filaments, thousands of them, gathered up into the ceiling and hanging down in a loose inverted bloom, each strand ending in a pale bead the size of a grain of rice. The whole thing stirred faintly, the way seaweed stirs in a slow current, though there was no wind in that sealed white room. It smelled very faintly, of iron and ozone, and something underneath that I didn't have a word for. The smell, I thought, of a great many other people's thoughts. A sesh stood beside the cradle. This one was old. I could tell because its skin had gone from gray-green to nearly gray, and the flecks had gone out of it, so that it held its shape stiffly, like something carved. Its receptor cluster was larger than the others I'd seen, and denser, and when it turned the full weight of it on me, the pressure behind my eyes was not a thumb or a palm, but a hand closing slowly around the back of my skull. "Sit," it said. I sat. The cradle was wrong for me in every dimension, and I let it be wrong, and did not squirm to make it fit. The old sesh watched me not fit with what I would later understand was professional interest. "I am Examiner Toll," it said. "I have read 410,000 minds. I have read every kind of mind that has ever come through the reach of the deep, the swift ones, the slow ones, the cunning ones, the ones that think they can hide. There is nothing in a mind I have not already seen 1,000 times before it arrives." The receptors drifted, cataloging me. "You are a human. We have read 11 of your kind. All 11 conformed within the ordinary bands. You will not be different. Minds are not as various as the beings that carry them believe." "That may be true," I said. "It is true." It moved to a low console grown out of the wall and laid one long limb across it, and above me the bloom of filaments woke up. The beads began to glow, faintly, one after another, a slow tide of pale light moving down through the strands. The probe does not hurt. I say this because your kind reacts to the anticipation more than the event. It will enter your attention. It will follow your attention wherever it goes. It will find the shape of how you think, not what you know, the shape, and from the shape it will read your conformance. No mind survives the probe intact. I mean that plainly. Every mind that meets it is opened and read and closed again, slightly changed by having been known. This is not damage. It is the ordinary cost of being classified. Do you understand? "You're going to look inside my head," I said, "and I don't get a say in what you see." "Yes. And whatever you find, that's what I am from now on." "That is what you have always been," Examiner Toll said. The probe only tells you. The receptors fixed on me, and the hand around my skull tightened by a degree, and it said the thing I would carry out of that room and hold onto through everything that came after. No mind survives the probe intact. Hold still. I looked up into the slow-glowing bloom coming down toward my face, and I thought about instruments that lie to you if you let them, and I said, try harder. I don't think the translator carried the tone, but the old sesh went very still, the way a person goes still when they've heard a sound in an empty house. And then the probe came down. Here is the thing I understood in the first half second, and here is why everything after it happened the way it did. The probe followed my attention. Toll had told me that himself, plainly, because it had never once mattered before. Every mind it had ever read did the natural thing when something reached into it. It flinched toward the intrusion. It looked at the thing looking at it. That was the whole method. You can't help but attend to what frightens you, and the probe rode that attention straight down into the core of you and read the frightened shape it found there. But I had spent 11 years in the dark with instruments that lie. When you are alone in a survey drone 40 light minutes from the nearest voice, and a proximity alarm goes off, the thing that kills you is looking at the alarm. The alarm wants your whole mind. The alarm is loud and bright and certain, and it is very often wrong, and if you give it your attention, it takes your attention, and while you are staring at the false alarm, the real thing, the alarm was a bad translation of closes the distance. So you train yourself over years in a discipline that has no glory in it and no name that anyone outside the work would recognize. You learn to hold your attention on the dial and on the thing behind the dial at the same time. You learn to look at the alarm and pass the alarm at once. You learn to let the loud thing be loud in one part of your mind, while the rest of you keeps working, unhurried, on what's actually true. The probe was the loudest alarm I had ever felt. It came down into my attention like a flood coming into a low room, and every instinct I had screamed at me to turn and face it, to give it the frightened animal core it had come for. I let it be loud, and I kept working. I put my attention where I had put it 10,000 times in the dark, on the reading and on the thing behind the reading. I looked at the probe. I did not pretend it wasn't there. That never works. Pretending is just another way of giving a thing your whole mind. I looked right at it, and I also looked past it at the question of what it was and how it worked and what its next move would be. The way I'd look at a bad sensor and start diagnosing it even as it shrieked. I did not flinch toward it. I did not flinch away. I held the double attention that 11 years of solitude had beaten into me, and I let the flood pour into a room that would not give it a frightened core to read, because the frightened core was busy, calmly, watching the flood. The probe reached for the shape of how I think. And the shape of how I think is, look at the loud thing and keep working. So the probe reached down into my attention, and my attention was a man calmly diagnosing the probe. It followed me down and found me looking back up at it. It went deeper, to get behind me, and I was already behind it. Because that is what the discipline is, being behind the loud thing while it's still busy being loud. There was no frightened core. There was no still center it could open. Everywhere it reached, it found the same thing. Attention that had already accounted for it and moved on, working, patient, unafraid, describing the probe to itself the way I had described the sesh in the intake line, because the fastest way to stop being afraid of a thing is to describe it. I felt it hunting. I want to be clear that it did not hurt exactly, but it was the strangest sensation of my life, the feeling of something vast and certain moving through the rooms of your own head, opening doors and finding you already standing in every room it opens, calm, with your hands in your pockets, saying, yes, this door too. It went faster. It went everywhere at once. And everywhere at once I was there first, not because I was fast, but because I wasn't running. You cannot get behind a man who isn't running from you. You can only chase him, and he watches you chase. Somewhere far above me, in the white room, I heard the old examiner make a sound I hadn't heard a sesh make before. The bloom of filaments began to withdraw. Not smoothly, the way it had come down, but in fits, retracting and then reaching again, retracting and reaching, like a hand that has touched something hot and can't quite believe it and has to touch it once more to be sure. Each time it reached back in, I let it be loud and kept working, and it found me already there. The last thing it did before it pulled all the way up into the ceiling was strange, and I've thought about it a great deal since. For just a moment, right at the end, I felt the direction of the thing reverse. It had spent its whole existence flowing one way down in reading. And for one moment, tangled up in an attention it couldn't get behind, it flowed the other way, and I got a reading of my own. I felt, for less than a second, the shape of how the probe thinks. It thinks everything can be opened. It has never once been wrong. And then it was gone, up into the ceiling, and the beads went dark, and I was sitting in a cradle built for the wrong body, in a white room, looking at an old examiner who was no longer looking at me. Its receptors had scattered. That's the only way I can describe it. The dense dark cluster that had closed around my skull like a hand had come apart, the way a school of fish comes apart when something moves through it, each receptor pointing a different direction, none of them at me. "That's not possible," Toll said. The translator gave me the words flat, but the wet original underneath them was not flat at all. "The reading did not close. The reading does not, it always closes. I close it. I have closed 410,000. It did not close." "No," I agreed. "What are you?" It wasn't a question. It had lost the shape of a question somewhere in the last 90 seconds. "What are you?" I stood up out of the wrong-shaped cradle, and my knees ached the way they always did, and I said the truest thing I knew. "I'm a man who spent a long time in the dark, learning not to look at the loud thing." I rolled my shoulder where the cradle had pinched it. "You told me the probe follows attention. I just didn't give it mine." The receptors tried to gather back into a cluster and couldn't quite manage it. And I understood, standing there, that I had done something to this old creature that no exam is supposed to be able to do to the one giving it. I had reached back out through the frame. I want to say I felt triumphant. I didn't. Mostly I felt tired and sorry for the old thing, and very aware that I was one small man 3 systems from anywhere in a building full of creatures who had just discovered that their oldest certainty had a hole in it, and that I was standing in the hole. "You'll want to file that as an error," I said, not unkindly. "I'd let you, but I don't think the hall accepts errors. You told me that yourself, only inputs." The arch on the far side of the room opened, though I hadn't seen anyone open it. "Go," Toll said. "Go to the holding tier. Do not speak to the others. Do not—" The receptors scattered again. "I have to report an unclassified mind. In 410,000 readings I have never filed an unclassified mind. There is not a form for it." "Then you'll make one," I said, and went out through the arch, and left the old examiner alone with the withdrawn probe and the first uncertainty of its very long life. The holding tier was a long curved gallery of cells, and the cells had no doors, only a threshold that hummed when you got near it and pushed back, gently and absolutely, so that you could see the corridor and the other cells perfectly well and could not take a single step into them. I sat on the grown-out ledge that served as a bench and looked at my hands and waited to find out what an institution does when it meets the one thing it was built to make impossible. I did not have to wait long, and I did not get to wait quietly, because 3 cells down was Vessel of the 9th reading. It had conformed, of course. It had gone into its own reading and come back out classified at the highest band, exactly as its line had for 6 generations, and it should have been long gone to whatever glory the highest band bought you. But it was here, in a doorless cell on the holding tier, and when it saw me, its receptors snapped into a tight, furious point, and I understood that being held near me was itself the insult. "They put me here," it said. The translator was calm, the wet voice under it was not. "The 9th reading. They put me in the holding tier beside a deviation because the deviation broke the examiner, and now every reading in the batch is under review. Do you understand what you have cost? My classification is provisional. Provisional. My line has never held a provisional classification. Because of you." "I didn't touch your reading," I said. "You touched the probe. The The probe touched all of us. If the probe can be, it stopped. It could not say the word. I realized it did not have the word, that its language, built by a species that had never once been wrong about a mind, might not contain a clean way to say fooled. If the probe can fail to close one reading, it managed, then no reading is closed. Do you see? Every mind it has ever read, it now might not have read truly. Every classification, every generation of my line. The point of its receptors trembled. You did not deviate, human, you unmade certainty. That is worse. I sat with that because it was true, and because there is a kind of person, human or otherwise, who is more frightened by a crack in the certainty than by any danger the crack might let in, and I could hear that I was talking to one. Vessel was not afraid that I was dangerous. Vessel was afraid that I existed, because as long as I existed, the sentence that had defined its entire line, the probe does not fail, was no longer true, and a being whose whole identity is built on a sentence does not survive the sentence becoming false. It survives by making the exception go away. You want to make me not have happened, I said. The receptors flared. The holding tier has procedures, it said, and there was something new under the fury now, something patient and cold that I liked much less than the anger. Unclassified inputs are not held indefinitely. They are represented to the probe and represented. A mind can be read many times, human. Each reading changes it slightly, the examiner told you surely. A mind read enough times conforms. It has to. There is a limit to how long any shape can hold against the probe. The 11th reading, or the 50th, or the 500th. Eventually the shape wears down and the reading closes and the input is named, and then it is filed, and then it never was an exception at all. The cold patience settled over its whole body. I have asked to observe your representations, all of them. I will watch the probe wear you down to an ordinary name, and when it does, my classification will cease to be provisional, and the sentence will be true again, and you will have been a filing error after all. I looked at it a long time. How many times, I said, do you think a man can hold still? No mind survives the probe intact, Vessel said, and there was the ghost of Toll's certainty in it, borrowed, clung to. You are only postponing your name. Maybe, I said, and I meant it because I am not a fool, and I did not know what 50 readings would do to me, or 500, and the honest answer was that I didn't know if the discipline would hold. But I also knew something Vessel didn't, something that 11 years in the dark teaches you, and that no amount of reading minds can teach a creature that has never been alone. The loud thing is patient. But so is the man who has learned not to look at it. The alarm can scream for 40 minutes. You can watch it scream for 41. You should rest, I told Vessel. If you're going to watch all of them, you'll be here a while. It did not answer, and I let the silence be, and I spent the rest of that first cycle doing the thing I do best, which is watching. The holding tier held more than Vessel and me. Across the gallery and down its slow curve were the others who'd gone through the arch before me, and I could see them from my doorless cell, and I made myself look, because I wanted to understand what the probe did to a mind that gave it what it wanted. The shivering beetle was 4 cells down, and it had stopped shivering. I've said that already, but I hadn't understood it until I watched it for an hour. It sat in the exact center of its cell and did not move, not the small, constant movements a living thing makes without meaning to, and I realized the stillness was the classification. Whatever the probe had read in the frightened core of it, whatever name it had closed the beetle into, the name had a shape, and the shape was still, and the creature had gone into the shape the way water goes into a mold. It wasn't broken. That's what unsettled me. It was worse than broken. It was finished. The probe had reached in and found the trembling and named it and closed it, and now the beetle was whatever the name said and would be, and there was a terrible peace in it that I did not want any part of. The translucent humming one was across the way, and it had stopped humming, and it moved now with a smooth, deliberate economy that its earlier fear hum had made impossible, and it did not look at anyone, and I understood that it too had been read and named and closed, poured into whatever shape its frightened core had confessed to. Both of them had walked into the arch afraid and come out certain. And the certainty was the classification. And the classification was the whole point of the place. And I sat in my cell and felt something I hadn't expected, which was not fear for myself, but a low, steady grief for them. For the shivering thing that would never shiver again and the humming thing that would never hum. Because the deep had reached into the softest, most frightened part of them and used it as the seed of the rest of their lives. There was one more. Down at the far bend of the gallery, almost out of sight, was a cell with a cadet in it that had not gone still and had not gone smooth. A sesh, young, one of the lower bands by the plainness of it, and it was moving, packing the small cell, receptors scattered, in a state I recognized because it was the only state on that whole tier that looked like a living thing in trouble rather than a living thing resolved. I watched it a long time. It caught me watching once and its receptors fixed on me, and there was something in the pressure of its look that wasn't the institutional push of the others. It was a question. I found out later, it told me itself, in the days of silence at the end, that its reading had half closed. Not clean like the beetle, not clean like the humming one. The probe had reached into it and found a frightened core that was itself uncertain, a young mind that hadn't finished deciding what it was, and the probe had closed it anyway, into a name that didn't quite fit, and the cadet had come out the arch classified into a shape it could feel was wrong and could not argue with, because there is no arguing with the probe. It was the loneliest thing on the tier. The finished ones had their terrible peace. This one had a name it didn't believe and no permission to disbelieve it, and it paced its cell, and it watched the deviation 4 cells down who had not been named at all, and I think that was the first place in the whole deep where something like hope got loose, though neither of us had a word for it yet. I lay back on the wrong-shaped ledge and closed my eyes, and I did not sleep, because a man in a doorless cell in a building that wants to name him does not sleep. But I rested the way I'd learned to rest in the dark, which is to let the body go slack while one small watchtower of the mind stays lit. And I thought about the beetle's stillness and the young one's packing, and I understood the choice the deep was really offering, under all the procedure. You could give it your frightened core and be named and be at peace, finished, a shape poured into a mold. Or you could refuse and be nothing they had a name for, and pace your cell alone at the far bend of the gallery where the light was the same as everywhere else and the shadows still didn't fall. Those were the two ends of it, peace with a name or loneliness without one. And I lay there in the flat white light and knew which one I was because I'd known it for 11 years, alone in the dark, refusing to run from the loud red thing. I was the packing kind. I always had been. The deep was just the first place that had ever tried to close me into the other. They came for me the next cycle and represented me to the probe, and it did not close. I won't walk you through all of it the way it happened, because it happened many times, and the middle of a thing like that is mostly the same shape repeating. And I promised myself when I started telling this that I would not pad the parts that don't earn their place. But I will tell you the readings that mattered, because each one taught the sesh something, and the thing they learned, cycle by cycle, was the slow undoing of the oldest certainty in the deep. The second reading, they changed the examiner. Toll had been rattled. They brought in a younger one, denser, more aggressive, a sesh named Chels whose receptors moved fast and hungry, and Chels drove the probe harder than Toll had, down and down, reaching for a frightened core with a kind of violence Toll had been too old and too sure to bother with. It didn't matter. The discipline isn't about how hard you're pushed. It's about where you put your attention, and I put mine where I always put it, on the reading and the thing behind it. And Chels chased me through my own head and found me already there, hands in my pockets and pulled out shaking. But something happened in that second reading that I've never told anyone, and it's the reason I understood that early that I was going to be all right. When Chels drove the probe down hard, harder than Toll, I felt it lose patience. And a thing that loses patience makes a mistake. It moves too fast, it commits, it stops watching and starts grabbing. I had seen it 1,000 times in my own instruments, an eager sensor that stops reading and starts insisting. And when the probe grabbed, when it stopped following my attention and lunged for where it expected the frightened core to be, it went past me. For just an instant it overshot, reached down into the empty place where a frightened core should have been and wasn't. And in that instant I felt it flail, a vast certain thing, groping in a room it had expected to be furnished and finding bare. It's a feeling I know. It's the feeling of an alarm that has fired on nothing and doesn't understand why the target isn't there. And I understood in that overshoot that the harder they drove the probe, the worse it would do, because speed is the enemy of reading a thing that isn't running. You cannot lunge at a man who's standing still. You just go past him into the wall and he watches you hit it. Chels pulled the probe out shaking, and I sat in the wrong-shaped cradle and I was tired. But I was not afraid anymore, because I had felt the shape of how the thing failed, and a thing whose failure you understand is a thing you can outlast. The third reading they tried to trick me. They told me the probe was disabled, that this was only a calibration, that I could relax, and then drove it in the moment they thought I'd dropped my guard. But I did not relax, because you do not survive 11 years in the dark by believing the alarm has been disabled. The alarm is never disabled. You watch it whether it's screaming or silent, because silence is just another reading, and a reading can lie. The probe came in and found me watching, calm, having never once believed them, and it did not close. I'll tell you how I knew it was a trick, because it wasn't cleverness, it was just the work. When they told me the probe was disabled, I looked at the telling the way I'd look at any reading, and the telling was too convenient. In 11 readings, this was only the third, but I mean the principle, nothing about the deep had been gentle or reassuring, and now suddenly, off cycle, they wanted me relaxed. A reassurance that arrives exactly when your guard would help them most is not a reassurance. It's a lever. I'd had instruments do the same thing, go quiet and clean right before the real event. Because the thing that was about to hit me was in the sensor's blind spot and the clean reading was the shape of its absence. So when the kind voice told me to relax, I heard the shape of a lever, and I did not relax, and I watched the disabled probe the whole time it pretended to be off, and when it woke and lunged I was already looking at it, and it did not close. The examiner that ran that one, Chels again, I think, though they'd stopped telling me names by then, made the sound. The one Toll had made, the not closing sound, and left the room without a word. The fourth reading, and the fifth, and the sixth, they simply drove it longer. Toll had said 90 seconds. By the sixth reading they were holding the probe in me for a quarter of an hour, then half an hour, then longer, betting that the sheer duration would wear the shape down, that no attention could hold its double focus for an hour, that eventually I would tire and turn and give the thing my frightened whole self. And here is what they did not understand, because they had never been alone. I had held that focus for 11-hour watches, alone in the dark, with my life on the dial. Half an hour was nothing. The fifth reading was the long one, the one where I learned exactly how much duration cost me, and it's worth telling straight, because it's the closest I came to losing. They held the probe in me for what I later worked out was near 2 hours. 2 hours is a long time to hold anything, and a mind is heavier than an arm. The trick of the double attention is not free. It costs, the way holding a weight at arm's length costs, a little at first and then more and then a great deal, and somewhere in the second hour I felt the cost coming due. My attention wanted to collapse, to fall in toward the probe or fall away from it, either one, just to stop holding the impossible middle. I felt the shape start to soften. And for the first and only time in the whole ordeal, I felt the probe feel it too, felt it press into the softening place. Eager, sensing after 2 dead hours that at last the shape was giving. And I did the thing that 11 years had taught me, and no reading could teach a creature that had never been alone. I did not fight the tiredness. Fighting the tiredness is just another loud thing, another alarm, and if you attend to it, it takes you. I let the tiredness be loud, and I kept working, and I let one part of me be exhausted while another part, unhurried, went on holding the middle, because the secret of the 11-hour watch is that you do not hold on with your strength. Strength runs out. You hold on by not needing to hold on, by making the double attention so ordinary, so much just how you are, that it costs nothing to continue because continuing is the same as existing. I stopped trying to keep the shape and simply was the shape, the way a river doesn't try to be a river, and the softening stopped. Not because I forced it, because I stopped forcing anything, and there was nothing left for the tiredness to work against. The probe pressed into the soft place and found it had gone firm again, not with effort but with surrender. And after 2 hours it pulled out, and I sat in the cradle so tired I could barely stand, and it had not closed, and I understood that they could not win with duration, because duration is a contest of effort and I had stopped competing. They saw it too. That was the reading, I think, where the deep first understood it was not going to wear me down, not because I was strong, but because I had found the one way to be immovable, which is to stop resisting. Through all of it, Vessel watched. They let it, because they were sesh, and a certainty under threat draws them the way a wound draws pressure, and the whole holding tier had begun to fill with observers. Young cadets pulled from their tracks, old examiners called up from the lower deep, administrators whose classifications depended on the probe being what it had always been. They lined the gallery outside the reading room and watched through the transparent wall, cycle after cycle, and I could feel the mood of them changing, the way you can feel weather change in a sealed room, and it changed the way weather does before something breaks. Because here is what the crowd was learning, whether they wanted to or not. They had built their entire civilization on the sentence no mind survives the probe intact. Everything rested on it, who bred, who flew, who was discarded, who was worthy, 11,000 years of whois. What all balanced on the single certainty that the probe reads true and the reading closes. And they were watching, cycle after cycle, a small soft creature from a survey contract sit in a chair built for the wrong body and be read and read and read, and not close. Every reading that didn't close was a stone pulled out of the foundation, and the crowd could count. Around the 9th reading, a young cadet in the gallery, not Vessel, a smaller one from one of the lower bands, did something that I think broke a rule because the sesh around it flinched away as if it had caught fire. It pressed one limb flat against the transparent wall, toward me, and held it there. I didn't know what it meant, but an older sesh beside it slowly, after a long moment, did the same, and then a third. I found out later, much later, that among the sesh this gesture had no formal meaning at all, that it was something their young did instinctively toward a thing they could not classify and had decided, against all their training, not to fear. There was no word for it. They were inventing one, on the glass, in real time, because I had put a hole in their certainty, and something had to grow in the hole. I knew that young cadet. It was the packing one from the far bend of the gallery, the one whose reading had half closed, that had come out of the arch named into a shape it could feel was wrong. They had let it up into the observation gallery, I think, precisely because its classification was in doubt, and a doubtful classification draws the deep the way a doubtful reading drew me. And it had watched, cycle after cycle, a creature the probe could not name at all, and something had come loose in it. When it pressed its limb to the glass, it was not making a formal gesture. It was reaching toward the one thing in that building that told it a mind did not have to accept the name the probe closed it into. I was the proof it hadn't known it was allowed to want. Between the readings, and there were long hours between them now, the deep conferring in whatever way the deep conferred, they moved me back to the holding tier, and once, only once, they made the mistake of holding the packing cadet in the cell beside mine. I don't think it was permitted. I think someone in the administration was as curious as I was about what a half-named mind and an unnamed one would say to each other, and let it happen off the record, the way a thing gets let happen when the rules are already coming apart. It didn't waste the time. Its receptors fixed on me through the gap between the cells, and the pressure of its look was the question again, sharper now. "You do not close," it said. The translator was very quiet. "Every cycle they take you to the probe, and every cycle you come back not closed. I have watched. The others watch because they are afraid of what it means for the sentence. I watch because it stopped. It didn't have the words, and I understood that its whole language, like vessels, was built by a species that had never needed a way to say I was named wrong. My reading did not close cleanly, it said finally. The probe reached into me and I was not finished. I was still deciding what I was. And it closed me anyway into a low band, a discard-adjacent band, because that is the shape it found in a mind that had not chosen yet. It found the not choosing and named it weakness. And I cannot argue. There is no arguing with the probe. The reading is the reading. The receptors trembled the way Vessels had, but this was a different trembling. Vessels was fury at a broken sentence, and this was something younger and worse. But you argue. You argue every cycle just by existing. How?